All right, let's do this. Let's get the GarageBand recording. Chapter 6, Education for All. We have seen that education through the liberal arts and great books is the best education for the best. We have seen that the democratic ideal requires the attempt to help everybody get this education. We have seen that none of the great changes, the rise of experimental science, specialization, and industrialization, makes this attempt irrelevant. On the contrary, these changes make the effort to give everybody this education more necessary and urgent. We must now return to the most important question, which is, can everybody get this education? When an educational ideal is proposed, we are entitled to ask in what measure it can be achieved. If it cannot be achieved at all, those who propose it may properly be accused of irresponsibility or disingenuousness. Such accusations have in fact been leveled against those who propose the ideal of liberal education for all. Many sincere Democrats believe that those who propose this ideal must be anti-democratic. Some of these critics are carried away by an educational version of the doctrine of guilt by association. They say, the ideal that you propose was put forward by and for aristocrats. Aristocrats are not Democrats. Therefore, neither you nor your ideal is democratic. The answer to this criticism has already been given. Liberal education was aristocratic in the sense that it was the education of those who enjoyed leisure and political power. If it was the right education for those who had leisure and political power, then it is the right education for everybody today. That all should be well acquainted with, and each in his measure actively and continuously engaged in the great conversation that man has had about what is and should be, does not seem on the face of it an anti-democratic desire. It is only anti-democratic if, in the name of democracy, it is erecting an ideal for all that all cannot in fact achieve. But if this educational ideal is actually implicit in the democratic ideal, as it seems to be, then it should not be refused because of its association with a past in which the democratic ideal was not accepted. Many convinced believers in liberal education attack the ideal of liberal education for all on the ground that if we attempt to give liberal education to everybody, we shall fail to give it to anybody. They point to the example of the United States, where liberal education has virtually disappeared, and say that this catastrophe is the inevitable result of taking the dogma of equality of educational opportunity seriously. The two criticisms I have mentioned come to the same thing, that liberal education is too good for the people. The first group of critics and the second unite in saying that only the few can acquire an education that was the best for the best. The difference between the two is in the estimate they place on the importance of the loss of liberal education. The first group says that, since everybody cannot acquire a liberal education, democracy cannot require that anybody should have it. The second group says that, since everybody cannot acquire a liberal education, the attempt to give it to everybody will necessarily result in an inferior education for everybody. The remedy is to segregate the few who are capable from the many who are incapable, and see to it that the few, at least, receive a liberal education. The rest can be relegated to vocational training or any kind of activity in school that happens to interest them. The more logical and determined members of this second group of critics will confess that they believe that the great mass of mankind is, and of right ought, to be condemned to a modern version of natural slavery. Hence, there is no use wasting educational effort upon them. They should be given such training as will be necessary to enable them to survive. Since all attempts to do more will be frustrated by the facts of life, such attempts should not be made. Because the great bulk of mankind have never had the chance to get a liberal education, it cannot be proved that they can get it. Neither can it be proved that they cannot. The statement of the ideal, however, is of value in indicating the direction that education should take. For example, if it is admitted that the few can profit by liberal education, then we ought to make sure that they, at least, have the chance to get it. It is almost impossible for them to do so in the United States today. Many claims can be made for the American people, but nobody would think of claiming that they can read, write, and figure. Still less would it be maintained that they understand the tradition of the West, the tradition in which they live. The products of American high schools are illiterate, and a degree from a famous college or university is no guarantee that the graduate is in any better case. One of the most remarkable features of American society is that the difference between the uneducated and the educated is so slight. The reason for this phenomenon is, of course, that so little education takes place in American educational institutions. But we still have to wrestle with the question of why this should be so. Is there so little education in the American educational system because that system is democratic? Are democracy and education incompatible? Do we have to say that if everybody is to go to school, the necessary consequence is that nobody will be educated? Since we do not know that everybody cannot get a liberal education, it would seem that if this is the ideal education, we ought to try to help everybody get it. Those especially who believe in getting the facts and the experimental method should be the first to insist that until we have tried, we cannot be certain that we shall fail. The business of saying in advance of a serious effort that the people are not capable of achieving a good education is too strongly reminiscent of the opposition to every extension of democracy. This opposition has always rested on the allegation that the people were incapable of exercising intelligently the power they demanded. Always the historic statement has been verified. You cannot expect the slave to show the virtues of the free man unless you first set him free. When the slave has been set free, he has, in the passage of time, become indistinguishable from those who have always been free. There appears to be an innate human tendency to underrate the capacity of those who do not belong to our group. Those who do not share our background cannot have our ability. Foreigners, people who are in a different economic status, and the young seem invariably to be regarded as intellectually backward, and constitutionally so, by natives, people in our economic status, and adults. In education, for example, whenever a proposal is made that looks toward increased intellectual effort on the part of students, professors will always say that the students cannot do the work. My observation leads me to think that what this usually means is that the professors cannot or will not do the work that the suggested change requires. When, in spite of the opposition of the professors, the change has been introduced, the students, in my experience, have always responded nobly. We cannot argue that, because those Irish peasant boys who became priests in the Middle Ages, or those sons of American planters and businessmen who became the founding fathers of our country, were expected, as a matter of course, to acquire their education through the liberal arts and great books. Every person can be expected, as a matter of course, to acquire such an education today. We do not know the intelligent quotients of the medieval priests or of the founding fathers. They were probably high. But such evidence as we have in our own time, derived from the experience of 2 or 3 colleges that have made the great conversation the basis of their course of study, and from the experience of that large number of groups of adults who for the past 8 years have been discussing great books in every part of the United States, suggests that the difficulties of extending this educational program to everybody may have been exaggerated. Great books are great teachers. They are showing us every day what ordinary people are capable of. These books came out of ignorant, inquiring humanity. They are usually the first announcements of success in learning. Most of them were written for and addressed to ordinary people. If many great books seem unreadable and unintelligible to the most learned as well as to the dullest, it may be because we have not for a long time learned to read by reading them. Great books teach people not only how to read them, but also how to read all other books. This is not to say that any great book is altogether free from difficulty. As Aristotle remarked, learning is accompanied by pain. There is a sense in which every great book is always over the head of the reader. He can never fully comprehend it. That is why the books in this set are infinitely rereadable. That is why these books are great teachers. They demand the attention of the reader and keep his intelligence on the stretch. As Whitehead has said, whenever a book is written of real educational worth, you may be quite certain that some reviewer will say that it will be difficult to teach from it. Of course it will be difficult to teach from it. If it were easy, the book ought to be burned, for it cannot be educational. In education, as elsewhere, the broad primrose path leads to a nasty place. But are we to say that because these books are more difficult than detective stories, pulp magazines, and textbooks, therefore they are to remain the private property of scholars? Are we to hold that different rules obtain for books on the one hand and painting, sculpture, and music on the other? We do not confine people to looking at poor pictures and listening to poor music on the ground that they cannot understand good pictures and good music. We urge them to look at as many good pictures and hear as much good music as they can, convinced that this is the way in which they will come to understand and appreciate art and music. We would not recommend inferior substitutes, because we would be sure that they would degrade the public taste rather than lead it to better things. If only the specialist is to be allowed access to these books on the ground that it is impossible to understand them without scholarship, if the attempt to understand them without scholarship is to be condemned as irremediable superficiality, then we shall be compelled to shut out the majority of mankind from some of the finest creations of the human mind. This is aristocracy with a vengeance. Sir Richard Livingstone said, "No doubt a trained student will understand Aeschylus, Plato, Erasmus, and Pascal better than the man in the street, but that does not mean that the ordinary man cannot get a lot out of them. Am I not allowed to read Dante because he is full of contemporary allusions and my knowledge of his period is almost nil? Or Shakespeare, because if I had to do a paper on him in the Oxford Honors School of English Literature, I should be lucky to get a fourth class? Am I not to look at a picture by Velázquez or Cézanne because I shall understand and appreciate them far less than a painter or art critic would? Are you going to postpone any acquaintance with these great things to a day when we are all sufficiently educated to understand them? A day that will never come? No, no. Sensible people read great books and look at great pictures, knowing very little of Plato or Cézanne, or of the influences which molded the thought or art of these men, quite aware of their own ignorance, but in spite of it, getting a lot out of what they read or see. Sir Richard goes on to refer to the remarks of T.S. Eliot. In my own experience of the appreciation of poetry, I have always found that the less I knew about the poet and his work before I began to read it, the better. An elaborate preparation of historical and biographical knowledge has always been to me a barrier. It is better to be spurred to acquire scholarship because you enjoy the poetry than to suppose that you enjoy the poetry because you have acquired the scholarship. Even more important than the dogma of scholarship in keeping people from the books is the dogma of individual differences. This is one of the basic dogmas of American education. It runs like this: all men are different, therefore, all men require a different education. Therefore, anybody who suggests that their education should be in any respect the same has ignored the fact that all men are different. Therefore, nobody should suggest that everybody should read some of the same books. Some people should read some books. Some should read others. This dogma has gained such a hold on the minds of American educators that you will now often hear a college president boast that his college has no curriculum. Each student has a course of study framed or tailored, is the usual word, to meet his own individual needs and interests. We should not linger long in discussing the question of whether a student at the age of 18 should be permitted to determine the actual content of his education for himself. As we have a tendency to underrate the intelligence of the young, we have a tendency to overrate their experience and the significance of the expression of interests and needs on the part of those who are inexperienced. Educators ought to know better than their pupils what an education is. If educators do not, they have wasted their lives. The art of teaching consists in large part of interesting people in things that ought to interest them, but do not. The task of educators is to discover what an education is and then to invent the methods of interesting their students in it. But I do not wish to beg the question. The question, in effect, is this: is there any such thing as an education? The answer that is made by the devotees of the dogma of individual differences is no. There are as many different educations as there are different individuals. It is authoritarian to say that there is any education that is necessary or even suitable for every individual. So Bertrand Russell once said to me that the pupil in school should study whatever he liked. I asked whether this was not a crime against the pupil. Suppose a boy did not like Shakespeare. Should he be allowed to grow up without knowing Shakespeare? And if he did, would he not look back upon his teachers as cheats who had defrauded him of his cultural heritage? Lord Russell replied that he would require a boy to read one play of Shakespeare. If he did not like it, he should not be compelled to read any more. I say that Shakespeare should be a part of the education of everybody. The point at which he is introduced into the course of study, the method of arousing interest in him, the manner in which he is related to the problems of the present may vary as you will. But Shakespeare should be there because of the loss of understanding, because of the impoverishment that results from his absence. The comprehension of the tradition in which we live and our ability to communicate with others who live in the same tradition and to interpret our tradition to those who do not live in it are drastically affected by the omission of Shakespeare from the intellectual and artistic experience of any of us. If any common program is impossible, if there is no such thing as an education that everybody ought to have, then we must admit that any community is impossible. All men are different, but they are also the same. As we must all become specialists, so we must all become men. In view of the ample provision that is now made for the training of specialists, in view of the divisive and disintegrative effects of specialism, and in view of the urgent need for unity and community, it does not seem an exaggeration to say that the present crisis calls, first of all, for an education that shall emphasize those respects in which men are the same, rather than those in which they are different. The West needs an education that draws out our common humanity rather than our individuality. Individual differences can be taken into account in the methods that are employed and in the opportunities for specialization that may come later. In this connection, we might recall the dictum of Rousseau. It matters little to me whether my pupil is intended for the army, the church, or the law. Before his parents chose a calling for him, nature called him to be a man. When he leaves me, he will be neither a magistrate, a soldier, nor a priest. He will be a man. If there is an education that everybody should have, how is it to be worked out? Educators are dodging their responsibility if they do not make the attempt, and I must confess that I regard the popularity of the dogma of individual differences as a manifestation of a desire on the part of educators to evade a painful but essential duty. The editors of this set believe that these books should be central in education. But if anybody can suggest a program that will better accomplish the object they have in view, they will gladly embrace him and it. Chapter 7. The Education of Adults. The editors believe that these books should be read by all adults all their lives. They concede that this idea has novel aspects. The education of adults has uniformly been designed either to make up for the deficiencies of their schooling, in which case it might terminate when these gaps had been filled, or it has consisted of vocational training, in which case it might terminate when training adequate to the post in question had been gained. What is here proposed is interminable liberal education. Even if the individual has had the best possible liberal education in youth, interminable education through great books and the liberal arts remains his obligation. He cannot expect to store up an education in childhood that will last all his life. What he can do in youth is to acquire the disciplines and habits that will make it possible for him to continue to educate himself all his life. One must agree with John Dewey in this, that continued growth is essential to intellectual life. Twin aims that have animated mankind since the dawn of history are the conquest of nature and the conquest of drudgery. Now they seem in a fair way to be achieved, and the achievement seems destined, at the same time, to end in the trivialization of life. It is impossible to believe that men can long be satisfied with the kind of recreations that now occupy the bulk of their free time. After all, they are men. Man, though an animal, is not all animal. He is rational, and he cannot live by animal gratifications alone, still less by amusements that animals have too much sense to indulge in. A man must use his mind. He must feel that he is doing something that will develop his highest powers and contribute to the development of his fellow men, or he will cease to be a man. The trials of the citizen now surpass anything that previous generations ever knew. Private and public propaganda beats upon him from morning till night all his life long. If independent judgment is the sine qua non of effective citizenship in a democracy, then it must be admitted that such judgment is harder to maintain now than it ever has been before. It is too much to hope that a strong dose of education in childhood and youth can inoculate a man to withstand the onslaughts on his independent judgment that society conducts, or allows to be conducted against him every day. For this, constant mental alertness and mental growth are required. The conception of liberal education for adults that is here advanced has an important effect on our conception of education in childhood and youth, its purpose, and its content. If we are to expect the whole adult population to engage in liberal education, then the curriculum of schools, colleges, and universities should be constructed with this end in view. At present, it is built upon the notion, which is unfortunately correct, that nobody is ever going to get any education after he gets out of school. Here we encounter the melancholy fact that most of the important things that human beings ought to understand cannot be comprehended in youth. Although I have known several astronomers who were contributing to the international journals before the age of 16, I have never known a child of any age who had much that was useful to say about the organization of human society or the ends of human life. The great books of ethics, political philosophy, economics, history, and literature do not yield up their secrets to the immature. In the United States, if these works are read at all, they are read in school and college, where they can be only dimly understood and are never read again. Hence, Americans are unlikely to understand them fully. We are deprived of the light they might shed upon our present problems. Here, the theory that education must meet immediate needs comes in to complete the chaos in our educational institutions. If the aim of education is to meet the immediate needs of the person educated, and if he is never to have any more education after he gets out of educational institutions, then he must learn everything he might ever need while he is in these institutions. Since there is no way of telling what the graduate might need, the only way out is to offer him a little bit of everything, hoping that he will find some bits useful. So the American high school and college are jammed with miscellaneous information on every conceivable subject, from acrobatics to zymurgy. For who can say that some future high wire artist or brewer will not be found among the students? The great wild proliferation of the curriculum of American schools, colleges, and universities is the result of many influences. But we can say with some assurance that if adult life had been looked upon as a time for continued learning, the pressure toward proliferation would have been measurably reduced. A concern with liberal education for all adults is necessary if we are to have liberal education for anybody, because liberal education can flourish in the schools, colleges, and universities of a country only if the adult population understands and values it. The best way to understand and value something is to have it yourself. We hear a great deal today about the neglect of the liberal arts colleges and the decay of humanistic and social studies. It is generally assumed that all that these colleges and scholars require is money. If they had more money, their problems would be solved. We are led to believe that their failure to get money results from the obtuseness or perversity of college and university presidents. These officers are supposed to be interested in the development of natural science and technology at the expense of the liberal arts and the humanistic and social studies. One may be permitted to doubt whether the colleges of liberal arts and scholars in the humanities and the social studies could wisely spend more money than they have. The deficiencies of these institutions and individuals do not seem to result from lack of funds, but from lack of ideas. When the appeal for support of a college is based on the fact that its amenities are almost as gracious as those of the local country club, when scholars in the humanities and social studies, misled by their misconception of the scientific method and by the prestige of natural science, dedicate themselves to the aimless accumulation of data about trivial subjects, the problem does not seem to be financial. Unfortunately, the only problems that money can solve are financial problems. Institutions and subjects develop because people think they are important. The importance comes first, and the money afterward. The importance of experimental science is obvious to everybody. Science produced the atomic bomb, and the medical schools are doing almost as much to lengthen life as the departments of physics and chemistry are doing to shorten it. Many colleges of liberal arts and the researches of many scholars in the humanities and the social studies are important only to those whose livelihood depends upon them. Yet the great issues are there. What is our destiny? What is a good life? How can we achieve a good society? What can we learn to guide us through the mazes of the future from history, philosophy, literature, and the fine arts? These questions lie, for the most part, in the areas traditionally assigned to the liberal arts, the humanities, and the social studies. If through this set of books, or in any other way, the adult population of laymen came to regard these issues as important, if scholars in these fields were actually engaged in wrestling with these problems, if in a large number of homes all over the country these questions were being discussed, then two things would happen. It would become respectable for intelligent young people with ideas, to devote their lives to the study of these issues, as it is respectable to be a scientist or an engineer today. And the colleges of liberal arts and scholars in the humanities and the social sciences would receive all the support they could use. An axiomatic educational proposition is that what is honored in a country will be cultivated there. One object of this set of books is to do honor to the great tradition of the West, in the conviction that this is the way in which to promote its cultivation, elaboration, and extension, and to perpetuate it to posterity. Chapter 8: The Next Great Change. Since education is concerned with the future, let us ask ourselves what we know positively about the future. We know that all parts of the world are getting closer together in terms of the mechanical means of transportation and communication. We know that this will continue. The world is going to be unified by conquest or consent. We know that the fact that all parts of the world are getting closer together does not by itself mean greater unity or safety in the world. It may mean that we shall all go up in one great explosion. We know that there is no defense against the most destructive of modern weapons. Both the victor and the defeated will lose the next war. All the factors that formerly protected this country, geographical isolation, industrial strength, and military power, are now obsolete. We know that the anarchy of competing sovereign states must lead to war sooner or later. Therefore, we must have world law enforced by a world organization, which must be attained through world cooperation and community. We know that it will be impossible to induce all men to agree on all matters. The most we can hope for is to induce all men to be willing to discuss all matters instead of shooting one another about some matters. A civilization in which all men are compelled to agree is not one in which we would care to live. Under such circumstances, one world would be worse than many, for in many worlds there is at least the chance of escape from one to another. The only civilization in which a free man would be willing to live is one that conceives of history as one long conversation leading to clarification and understanding. Such a civilization presupposes communication. It does not require agreement. We know that time is of the essence. Every day we read announcements of advances in transportation and advances in destruction. We can now go round the world in the time it used to take to go from New York to Boston, and we can kill 250,000 people with one bomb. We are promised bigger and better instruments of mass murder in every issue of our daily papers. At the same time, the hostility among sovereign states is deepening by the hour. How can we prepare for a future like this? We see at once that the primary, not the incidental, participants in an educational program designed to cope with a future like this must be adults. They are in charge of the world. The rising generation, unless the adults in charge of the world can find some way of living together immediately, may never have a chance to rise. I do not wish to exaggerate the possibilities of adult education through great books and the liberal arts, or by any other means, as a method of preventing war. If all the adults in America could suddenly realize their full human potentialities, which is the object of liberal education, and the government of Russia remained what it is today, we might merely have the satisfaction of being blown up with our full human potentialities realized instead of unrealized. In view of the prevailing skepticism about the immortality of the soul, I cannot expect American readers to regard this as more than a dubious consolation. Yet there will not be much argument against the proposition that, on the whole, reasonable and intelligent people, even if they confront aggressively unreasonable or stupid people, have a better chance of attaining their end, which in this case is peace, than if they are themselves unreasonable and stupid. They may even be able, by their example, to help their opponents to become more reasonable and less stupid. The United States is now the most powerful country in the world. It has been a world power for a very short time. It has not had centuries of experience in which to learn how to discharge the responsibilities of a position into which it was catapulted against its will. Nor has it had the kind of education in the last 50 years that is conducive to understanding its position or to maintaining it with balance, dignity, and charity. An educational system that aims at vocational training or social adjustment or technological advance is not likely to lead to the kind of maturity that the present crisis demands of the most powerful nation in the world. A country that is powerful, inexperienced, and uneducated can be a great danger to world peace. The United States is unlikely to endanger peace through malevolence. The people of this country do not appear to bear any ill will toward any other people, nor do they want anything that any other people have. Since they are devoted to their own kind of society and government, they do not want any other nation to threaten the continued prosperity of their society and government. Any military moves made by the United States will be made in the conviction that they are necessary for the defense of this country. But this conviction may be mistaken. It may be hysterical, or it may be ignorant. We can easily blunder into war. Since we may have committed such a blunder even before these words appear in print, I must repeat that I do not wish to exaggerate the importance of these books or any other means of adult education as a method of preventing such a blunder. The time is short and education is long. What I am saying is that, since education is long and since it is indispensable, we should begin it right away. When Marshal Laity was in Africa, he asked his gardener to plant a certain tree, the foliage of which he liked very much. The gardener said that a tree of this kind took 200 years to reach maturity. In that case, said the marshal, there is no time to lose. Plant it today. The great conversation symbolizes that civilization of the dialogue, which is the only civilization in which a free man would care to live. It promotes the realization of that civilization here and now. This set of books is organized on the principle of attaining clarification and understanding of the most important issues, as stated by the greatest writers of the West, through continuous discussion. Its object is to project the great conversation into the future and to have everybody participate in it. The community toward which it is hoped that these books may contribute is the community of free minds. Now, the only defense that any nation can have is the character and intelligence of its people. The adequacy of that defense will depend upon the strength of the conviction that the nation is worth defending. This conviction must rest on a comprehension of the values for which that nation stands. In the case of the United States, those values are to be found in the tradition of the West. The tradition of the West is the great conversation. We have repeated to ourselves so much of late the slogan, America must be strong, that we have forgotten what strength is. We appear to believe that strength consists of masses of men and machines. I do not deny that they have their role, but surely the essential ingredients of strength are trained intelligence, love of country, the understanding of its ideals, and such devotion to those ideals that they become a part of the thought and life of every citizen. We cannot hope to make ourselves intelligible to the rest of the world unless we understand ourselves. We now present a confusing picture to other peoples largely because we are ourselves confused. To take only one example, how can we say that we are a part of the great tradition of the West, the essence of which is that nothing is to be undiscussed, when some of our most representative citizens constantly demand the suppression of freedom of speech in the interest of national security? Now that military power is obsolescent, the national security depends on our understanding of and devotion to such ancient Western liberties as free speech. If we abandon our ideals under external pressure, we give away without a fight what we would be fighting for if we went to war. We abandon the sources of our strength. How can we say that we are defending the tradition of the West if we do not know what it is? An educational program for young people or adults from which this tradition has disappeared fails, of course, to transmit it to our own people. It also fails to convince other people that we are devoted to it as we claim. Any detached observer looking at the American educational system can see that the bulk of its activity is irrelevant to any of the things we know about the future. Vocationalism, scientism, and specialism can, at the most, assist our people to earn a living and thus maintain the economy of the United States. They cannot contribute to the much more important elements of national strength, trained intelligence, the understanding of the country's ideals, and devotion to them. Nor can they contribute to the growth of a community in this country. They are divisive rather than unifying forces. Vocational training, scientific experimentation, and specialization do not have to supplant liberal education in order to make their economic contribution. We can have liberal education for all, and vocational training, scientific experimentation, and specialization too. We hear a great deal nowadays about international understanding, world community, and world organization. These things are all supposed to be good, but nothing very concrete is put forward as to the method by which they can be attained. We can be positive on one point. We are safe in saying that these things will not be brought about by vocational training, scientific experiment, and specialization. The kind of education we have for young people and adults in the United States today will not advance these causes. I should like to suggest one or two ways in which they may be advanced. We should first dispose of the proposition that we cannot have world organization, a world of law, without a world community. This appears to overlook the obvious interaction between legal institutions and culture. As Aristotle pointed out long ago, law is itself an educational force. The Constitution of the United States educates the people every day to believe in and support the Constitution of the United States. World community, in the sense of perfect understanding among all peoples everywhere, is not required in order to have the beginnings of world law. What is required is that minimum understanding which is sufficient to allow world law to begin. From that point forward, world law will support world community, and world community will support world law. For example, There are those who oppose the discussion of universal disarmament on the ground that disarmament is an effect and not a cause. They say that until the tensions in the world are removed, disarmament cannot take place, and that we shall simply deceive ourselves if we talk about it instead of doing something about the tensions. Actually, one way to do something about the tensions is to talk about disarmament. The manifestation of a general willingness to disarm under effective international regulation and control would do more to relieve the tensions in the world than any other single thing. Getting together to see whether such a plan could be formulated would relieve tension. No doubt there would be disappointments and the risk of exacerbating international irritations, but to refuse to discuss the principal method of mitigating tensions on the ground that they have to be mitigated before it is discussed does not seem to be the best way to mitigate them. What are the best ways of promoting that minimum of understanding which is necessary to permit world law to begin? If community depends on communication, we must ask what kinds of things can be most readily communicated to and comprehended by the largest number of people, and what kinds of things tell the most about the people who are doing the communicating. It appears that the kind of things that are most intelligible and most revealing are ideas and artistic objects. They are most readily understood. They are most characteristic of the peoples who have produced or stated them. We can learn more about another people from their artistic and intellectual productions than we can from all the statistics and data that can ever be collected. We can learn more, that is, of what we need to know in order to found the world community. We can learn more in the sense that we can understand more. What we have in this set of books is a means by which people who can read English can understand the West. We in the West can understand ourselves and one another. Peoples in other parts of the world can understand us. This leads to the idea that Scott Buchanan has put forward, the idea of a world republic of law and justice, and a world republic of learning, mutually supporting each other. Any republic maintains its justice, peace, freedom, and order by the exercise of intelligence. Every assent on the part of the governed is a product of learning. A republic is a common educational life in process. As Montesquieu said, that as the principle of an aristocracy was honor, and the principle of a tyranny was fear, the principle of a democracy was education. Thomas Jefferson took him seriously. Now we discover that a little learning is a dangerous thing. We see now that we need more learning, more real learning for everybody. The republic of learning is that the republic toward which all mere political republics gravitate, and which they must serve if they are to be true to themselves. No one saw this before yesterday, and we only today are able to begin to measure what we should do about it tomorrow. The immediate inference from this insight is a utopia for today. The immediate inference from this insight is a utopia for today. The extension of universal education to every man and woman, from childhood to the grave. It is time to take education away from the scholars and school teachers and to open the gates of the Republic of Learning to those who can and will make it responsible to humanity. Learning is in principle and should be in fact the highest common good. to be defended as a right and worked for as an end. All men are capable of learning, according to their abilities. Learning does not stop as long as man lives, unless his learning power atrophies because he does not use it. Political freedom cannot last without provision for the free, unlimited acquisition of knowledge. Truth is not long retained in human affairs without continual learning and relearning. A political order is tyrannical if it is not rational. If we aim at a world republic of law and justice, we must recover and revive the great tradition of liberal human thought, rethink our knowledge in its light and shadow, and set up the devices of learning by which everybody can, perhaps for the first time, become a citizen of the world. The kind of understanding that comes through belonging to the world republic of learning is the kind that constitutes the world community. The world republic of law and justice is nothing but the political expression of the world republic of learning and the world community. Chapter 9, East and West. At this point, I hear some readers say, the world community and the world republic of law and justice must be composed of all peoples everywhere. These are great books of the West. How can comprehension of the tradition they embody amount to participation in the world republic of learning? How can such comprehension promote world community, since great books of the East are not included? The editors reply that there is undoubtedly to be a meeting of East and West. It is now going on under rather unsatisfactory conditions. The editors believe that those who come to the meeting with some grasp of the full range of the Western tradition will be more likely to understand the East than those who have attended any number of the hastily instituted survey courses about the East proposed by educators who have been suddenly impressed by the necessity of understanding the East, and whose notion is that the way to understand anything is to get a lot of information about it. The editors are impressed by the many reminders given to the West by Eastern thinkers that the parts of the Western tradition that are now the least known and the least respected in America are the very parts most likely to help us understand the deepest thought of the East. On the other hand, the editors are convinced that those aspects of the West which the East finds most terrifying, its materialism, rapacity, and ethnocentric pride, will get no support from those great books which indicate the main line of the Western pursuit of wisdom. The editors believe that an education based on the full range of the Western search is far more likely to produce a genuine openness about the East, a genuine capacity to understand it, than any other form of education now proposed or practicable. The West can try, as the saying goes, to win the East by coming to the meetings between them with a few words adjusted directly to the questions that arise from the manner in which the East is, as the saying goes, awakening. There is no question that the West will inevitably be represented at these meetings by a good many of those social engineers who feel, in all ignorance, that they represent in splendor what 25 centuries of Western civilization have been laboring to produce. Scientific humanism, which has been vigorously and in high places presented as the new religion that the new one world needs, will certainly be represented. Some representatives will surely be making the offer of the magic trio, scientific method, technology, and the American way of life. It seems safe to predict, however, that these representatives of the West are likely to be understood only by those in the East who have already decided for Westernization. These representatives of the West may be considerably nonplussed by those in the East who are determined, however much they awaken in certain respects, to retain the central convictions and habits of thought of Eastern culture. As Ananda Kumaswamy has said, it is true that there is a modernized, uprooted East with which the West can compete, but it is only with the surviving superstitious East, Gandhi's East, the one that has never attempted to live by bread alone, that the West can cooperate. In seeking the cooperation of this modernized, uprooted East, the Western social engineers will find themselves, as is already menacingly clear, competing with the rulers of the Union. These rulers are bringing to the meetings of East and West a far more ruthless version of this latter-day shrunken Western voice. Their words are adjusted far more directly to the exact questions that are involved in the awakening of the East. The Russians seem prepared to offer the new Easterners a program uncomplicated by any concern about the old East. Perhaps these new Easterners, under Russian guidance, may carry through a new kind of reflexive imperialism, more ruthless toward the superstitious East, Gandhi's East, than any Western imperialist ever was. If the East, contrary to its deepest traditions, becomes totally absorbed with material comfort, there will be little about the East that we shall have to understand, since we already understand that kind of absorption only too well. We have never pictured the East as coming to share it. If the East does come to share it, the change may shock us, but it will raise no very difficult question of understanding. If, on the other hand, the awakening East tries to retain, beneath the new vigor of the drive toward material goods, its various forms of traditional religion, metaphysics, and ethics, the West, in trying to cooperate with the East, has something to understand. Under these circumstances, anyone, anywhere, in or out of the universities, who has attained some competence to bring forth a reading of the East that the West can understand, should be encouraged in every way to increase his competence and to make the results of his studies available. But the number of persons who can claim even such an initial competence is very small. Therefore, it is absurd to suggest, as many laymen and scholars are doing today, that a large part of the course of study of our educational system should be devoted to understanding the East. Few persons are less helpful to the world than those educators, infatuated with the magic of curriculum changes, who think that the teachers or the teachability of any subject they dream of can spring into existence by curricular decree. It is irresponsible to suggest that the East can be given a major place in the education of everybody when no more than a handful of teachers exists who could decently commit themselves to the teaching of such courses. The understanding of the East that would emerge from such courses, taught by instructors who had hastily read up on the East, could set communication and understanding back for generations. Professor John D. Wild of Harvard has lately commented on some educational proposals of Professor Howard Mumford Jones of Harvard. Mr. Wild says, I gather that Mr. Jones is worried about our capacity really to understand Russia and to set up a cooperative world community. So am I. But I am unable to follow him in the assumption that these crucially important aims will be achieved merely by setting up more machinery, professors, and secretaries, more fields and areas called the study of Russia and the study of the Orient. How are these things to be studied? From what sort of integrating point of view? Is he proposing an amalgam of Western, Chinese, and Russian culture? If so, what would this be like? Or is he proposing a sort of cultural relativism in which everyone seeks to divest himself so far as possible from all the culture he had? I do not believe that Mr. Jones is advocating either of these alternatives. I gather that he is interested in correcting the economic and social injustices that distort our present civilization, that he wishes to see the vast power which modern technology has put into our hands used intelligently for the common good. All this is in line with the best philosophical and religious thought of our Western tradition, when properly understood. I gather further that he feels that we should be humble about the rather rudimentary civilization we now possess at this early stage, precious as it is, and that we should be open to suggestions from alien sources. This also is thoroughly in line with what is best in our own tradition. If this is what Mr. Jones means, then what we need most of all is to recall the basic insights and principles, religious as well as philosophical, upon which our Western culture was founded, and then apply them to the critical problems of our time. Okay, let's stop there today. We're going to stop. We're on paragraph 2 in page 70 here. We're going to start with, so also Professor Lewis. Not the best place to stop, but if I go longer than an hour. So, I am going to catch up this summer. Muhammad, thank you so much for stopping by. I think I may have saw your comment and it made me be like, you know what? I really do got to get back on the great books. So I'm listening to you. I'm not giving up. It's a lifelong project. We'll keep it going. I will say what made me sit down and do this today. I think it was because we just had spring break. I've had about a week to decompress. And then I'm finally able to be like, you know what? I want to get back into that work. That's meaningful work. And I'm going to hop back into school teaching Tuesday. And I love school teaching. But for some reason, it just, 8 crazy hours makes it difficult to fit this in. But those are just excuses. These are serious first world problems. So we'll figure it out. I will say, if you want to support me in any way, there's lots of different ways in the description. Patreon's where I get the most support, but Buy Me a Coffee is really cool. PayPal's on there. Any of those. And the more I can make this an actual gig, then the less I can work at the Walmarts and the more chapters of the book I can crunch for you. But if you can't do that, the world's getting crazier and harder out there for everybody. So I completely understand. But if you got a bunch of money sitting around, you don't know what to do with it, feel free to give some to me. This school teacher, Walmart worker who reads the great books of the Western world. I love y'all. That's part 3. I'm going to be better about this. God bless y'all. Happy Easter. He is risen. Amen. See you next time.